All right, hello, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to tune you into some out-of-the-way studies that you might not otherwise encounter. And for the last few months, we've been doing Bible decodes coming from the Flavian hypothesis or the Roman origins hypothesis. From various different authors, but right now we are looking at the work of Michael Menescotz, and that's Menasgotz, and his book called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. And this is pretty much going to be he's talking about a lot of statistical stuff. Hopefully he'll get into a little bit of decoding here from the book of Luke. The Flavians were a dynasty of Caesars that lived, that ruled Rome from 69 to 96 AD. It includes Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian. And they, the first two of them, Titus and Vespasian, also fought in a war against the Jews called War of the Jews from 66 to 73 AD. They were the two generals, and then eventually they became emperors. And if you go, if you look at the history that the Romans put out about this war against the Jews, written by a person named Josephus, who was who claims was living at Caesar's palace and writing this in the early 70s AD, early to mid 70s AD, and was had his work endorsed by Titus. Josephus has written the history called the War of the Jews, and he goes over all the battles and all the drama that's going on in these various campaigns of the siege of Jerusalem, along with activity happening at Jotapata, at Masada, and he goes over Titus's 3-year military campaign in Judea from 70 to 73 AD. And, you know, he follows Titus around, and, you know, whatever battles he gets into, and his relating with his men and other adventures that he gets into that are more random. And if you examine the 3-year military campaign of Titus, you will notice that it is exactly the same as the 3-year ministry of Jesus that occurred exactly 40 years earlier. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus goes, in the same order, and offset by exactly 40 years. And every adventure that Titus gets into, Jesus gets into a parallel adventure, parallel situation that's not exactly the same, but is conceptually or typologically the same. Also, many prophecies that Jesus makes, and makes in a symbolic manner, are fulfilled literally by Titus, which makes Titus the second coming of Jesus. And there are various other kind of red flags of incredible parallels between this book, War of the Jews, which came out of Rome, out of Caesar's palace, and the New Testament of the Bible, in particular the Gospels. Now, why would the Romans do this? Well, they had a very clear motive, which was to domesticate or tame or prune or what was the other word? Mellow out the Jews. The Romans had taken over in Judea in 63 BC. So this was going on for over 100 years of just constant high maintenance from the Jews. They were always revolting and insurrecting, and it was a pain for the for the Romans to deal with. The Romans wanted to absorb the Jews like everybody else. They wanted everybody to kind of be in the kind of melting pot of the Roman Empire. They were tolerant of your religious beliefs as long as you were tolerant of theirs. But the Jews were not. The Jews believed they were the chosen people, and they believed in a monotheistic God who was jealous. And so, and also OCD. And so the jealous God saddled them with one ritual after another that had to be fulfilled. All the kosher food laws, the strictures against graven images, the circumcision laws, the animal sacrifice laws. These are all things that the Jews had to do, and they're all these things that the Romans didn't want them to do because they were a pain for the Romans to deal with. But the Jews and the Romans also wanted to put a statue of Caesar into the temple or into any of the holy places. They believed that, you know, you worship your own gods, but you also have to worship Caesar, you know. And the Romans, the Jews were willing to die to maintain their rituals. And so as a result, there were all these insurrections. And it culminated in this war against the Jews in 66 AD. The Jews were also waiting for a Messiah. Many prophecies in the Old Testament prophesied a Messiah coming at this time. But the Messiah that the Jews were waiting for was a military-oriented Messiah, one that was going to kick out the Romans and regain sovereignty for the Jews in Judea. And there were really three candidates for Messiah here in the 60s AD. Eleazar, Simon, and John, three Jewish zealots that kind of worked together, sometimes not, but they, and this is all according to the history that Josephus has written. And they kicked out the Herods, who were the kind of client government of the Romans with a lot of Jewish ties. They're said to be Idumean, but Herod was really about 20 different people that ruled at various times and places in Judea. And whichever Herod, I believe it was Agrippa, Herod Agrippa was kicked out of Jerusalem by Simon, John, and Eleazar. And so that prompted Emperor Nero to send in General Vespasian to quell the revolt. And this led to this War of the Jews that lasted for 7 years. So what the Romans and Titus, eventually Nero was assassinated and 3 other emperors were assassinated, and Vespasian became the new emperor, and he appointed his son Titus to be the new general. Both Titus and Vespasian were wounded in this war. And the Herods were also there at Rome to help out with the probably like the Jewish history, the Torah, knowledge of the Torah, and knowledge of the history of the history books too of the Old Testament, and the prophecies. And so they calculated all that and wrote this story of a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, to turning the other cheek to oppression, walking an extra mile with the Roman soldier's pack, and believing that the Roman slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Israel, and exhorted his God to forgive the Romans, for they know not what they do. While at the same time going outside the Jewish temple and overturning the tables of the money changers who were trading out the Roman coins with graven images on it for Jewish coins so that they could bring them into the temple without bringing a statue of Caesar in, or an inscription of Caesar in, and disrupting the commerce of the Jews who were selling pigeons and doves and rams and lambs to bring into the temple for animal sacrifices. So Jesus is intentionally and aggressively trying to stamp out the Jewish rituals, or at the same time being totally deferential to Rome. And if you read the Pauline epistles, Paul is even more pro-Roman than Jesus is. So that is peculiar. I would say a red flag. Another red flag is that the New Testament is written in Greek, which was the language of Rome. The commoners of Rome and the elite also spoke Greek. They spoke Latin too. And they wrote in both those languages in general, whereas Greek was much more rare in Judea. The followers of Jesus would have been speaking in Aramaic, using Hebrew letters. So, and then in addition, the Romans had a monopoly on censorship. They had a monopoly on publishing. They had a monopoly on distribution, having the only post office or the only postal service in the empire, and having the only, having access to thousands of slaves who could sit and copy these texts down over and over again. And these texts were really aimed to be performed live as plays in front of people, because most of the people didn't read in the first place. So they wrote themselves into these plays, more or less. And there are just many patterns involved that are head scratchers. And that's what Michael Menescotts does, is he digs into the book of Luke, and he found more than 250 parallels between the book of Luke and War of the Jews. And I mean, War of the Jews is 7 volumes, but they're short volumes. It's probably a little bit longer than the New Testament. It's much longer than the Gospels, much longer than the book of Luke. It's probably, I'm guessing that the War of the Jews is about as long as the New Testament in general. That's a total guess, though. But anyway, 250 parallels in just 24 chapters of Luke. And then he charted out the parallels and graphed them out on a graph, putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Every time he found a correspondence, he put a dot there. And the 250 plus dots make 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, the language of the Roman royals, the Caesars. So, and those 5 letters are A, P, T, V, S. The A and the P may be a little bit of a mystery. There's a little bit of controversy about what the A and the P stand for. But the TVS clearly stands for Titus Vespasianus. And that is really the meat of the chart. Most of the dots are in the T, V, and especially the V and the S. The A and the P is more of a skeleton letter. Just they're not well developed, and so it's quite possible that maybe a different emperor, maybe Domitian, who maybe wanted to be known as the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost, AP, Aegeon Pneuma, Pneuma with a P. And but the TVS, they use that in inscriptions for coins. So that is not any type of reach, what that means. So basically what it means is that not only did the Romans write the book of Luke, but they signed their name to it. And they did many other things to mock the Jews and anybody who believes in these Gospels. And I don't think that they thought it was going to last for 2,000 years. They put a lot of information within the Gospels that if you are an attentive reader, that you can figure out their language, you can figure out their code and what they're actually saying. And a lot of it is mocking, ridiculing, mean-spirited, violent, gay, pedophilic, certainly pornographic, cannibalistic. All of that is in the New Testament, but you're not seeing it because you're not looking for it. But once you start looking for it, it starts to stick out to you. Same with many of these parallels. Some of these parallels are really strong and they will knock your socks off. Some of them are very weak and you wouldn't find them unless you're looking for them. And it took Menescot's like 4 years to find more than 250. He thinks that he probably missed another 50 at least. But he believes that if he did find those other 50, they would also fit in the APTVS pattern, which you can see on the thumbnail for this video. So he's talking about a little bit about the odds that something like this would occur. And actually, I think his statistical analysis is actually on target. So at least this aspect of it. So here he goes. In theory, this is easily calculated if you use an online probability calculator. So he's looking for the event that such noteworthy parallels had occurred by chance, that they would, or coincidence, that they would then be arranged in the APTVS pattern. The odds are equal to achieving a 1 in 4 probability, because he says that there's only, like, the APTVS pattern takes up approximately 1/4 of the area of the chart. So in order for something to align with the chart, it's a 1 in 4 chance. And he's saying on at least 250 out of 400 tries. He's being conservative and saying that he found, say if he actually had found 400 of these parallels, that 250 of them would fit into the pattern. And so he says, in theory, this is easily calculated if you use an online probability calculator that can cope with such extremely low probabilities. The probability of at least 250 successes out of 400 tries, when each try has 1 in 4 odds, are less than 1 in 10 to the 56th, or put differently, 1 in 100 billion 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 billion. That's 1 with 56 zeros after it. That's the odds of this particular pattern occurring by chance. We should accordingly factor in how many distinctly different words or shapes or symbols could be formed, which would be seen as having similar religious relevance to Luke and Jewish war, or messages identifiable in their parallels, and which have such impressively regular and intentional seeming structure, as found in the even spacing, font, and letter height of the APTVS pattern. Yeah, all of the letters are pretty much the same size. It's just that the V and the S take up more, they're thicker. But you can see it on the thumbnail to the video. While also completely filling the chart area. I can't calculate that, but it's probably less than 1,000 and surely less than 1,000,000. For the sake of argument, it's certainly less than 1,000,000,000, so I'll deduct a factor of 1,000,000,000 from those odds. That suggests that the chances of such a remarkably relevant, regularly shaped, intentional seeming pattern are exactly filling the whole chart area and occurring by chance is about 10 to the 47th. Is there a weakness in this analysis? I imagine that a critic might be tempted to respond with, "You've completely failed to prove that a much greater number of noteworthy parallels doesn't exist, which don't match the APTVS pattern. If there were, say, 500 or 600 genuinely noteworthy parallels, then it becomes less impressive that 300 of them align with the APTVS pattern. Obviously, I cannot prove that some additional non-matching parallels don't exist, but if a critic imagines there to be 500 noteworthy parallels rather than the 350 to 400 I propose, this doesn't change that the numbers are against them. Redoing the mathematics a second time, we arrive at odds at still 10 to the 33rd, or 1 in 10 to the 33rd. So even if I had greatly understated the number of non-matching noteworthy parallels and even deducting that factor by the factor of 1,000,000,000 to account for a wide range of patterns that could be equally meaningful, relevant, and equally impressive in consistency of font and letter spacing, we still arrive at odds of 1,000,000 billion for such a pattern to occur by chance. Yeah, I mean, the fact that there are, I think he's kind of underestimating the fact that there are so many parallels. You can dismiss many of them as coincidences if they are seen just by themselves. But if you see like 200 of them, you know that they're not just a coincidence then. Okay, but is there a counter-argument here? The fact that stories have sections with varying lengths and topics surely makes lines more likely to appear by chance. As mentioned earlier, it was a simplification to assume that unintentional parallels would be distributed randomly, noting that some paragraphs and verses of the stories are longer than others. Although in the regions discussed there is nothing unusual in the lengths of the paragraphs or chapters that I focused on, it is obviously true that different chapters, verses, and paragraphs do have different lengths and also cover different topics, some of which are more likely to result in parallels than others. I do accept that this would have the effect of making a vertical or horizontal line more likely to appear by chance. However, by the same logic, this has the effect of making a diagonal line less likely to occur. Okay. I have shown mathematically that if I was guilty of faking the APTVS pattern, intentionally or otherwise, by selectively choosing from a body of unintentional and I swear I've read this before. I think maybe I flipped the page, but I flipped it backwards. I'm quite sorry about that. Let's try this page here. Okay, I'm doing something very wrong. Okay, let's see. The font for this book is so small that I have to take pictures of it to basically be able to read it. And I think I took a picture, but I called it the wrong thing. Okay, I believe we're on the right page now. Sorry about that. Okay, but the critic who supposes there might be 600 plus genuinely noteworthy parallels has a different problem to deal with. Namely, it is almost physically impossible for 600 parallels of the observed type to fit within the text of Luke, given that Luke is only 1,151 verses, and many of the parallels take multiple verses. Sometimes, 10, 20, even more verses. The vast majority of the parallels are one-to-one in style, only a few being many-to-one, typically involving multiple verses of Luke, and sometimes a great many, and on average at least 2 verses. So 600 genuinely noteworthy parallels would fill about 1,200 verses of Luke minimum, yet Luke only has 1,151 verses. And if the critic decides to accept that the entirety of Luke is filled with genuinely noteworthy parallels with Jewish war, how is the critic going to explain this, except by acknowledging that they are intentional parallels? And if the parallels are intentional, then the 2 parodies I have explained are also intentional, and since they involve both the stories parodying each other, it follows that they were written together, and the inevitable conclusion is that the Roman government created the Gospel of Luke. Because we all know that the Roman government created War of the Jews. Are there other ways to assess the possibility of the APTBS pattern being a series of coincidences? It was an early fan of my work who pointed out to me that over a decade ago, a researcher named Cliff Carrington had identified some parallels between the Gospels and Josephus's works, primarily antiquities of the Jews, but also Jewish war. These can still be found in an archive at his website. His name is Cliff Carrington, with a C. Naturally, I wanted to see if his parallels aligned with the APTBS pattern. Cliff didn't have a specific focus on Luke and have a habit of focusing on antiquities. Instead of tabulating parallels, now Antiquities of the Jews is the later work by Josephus that goes out in 20 volumes that he wrote much later in the 90s AD. If you believe in the existence of Josephus, even. He was probably this guy named Arius Piso, and who went under a number of different pseudonyms, including Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Instead of tabulating parallels between people described in the texts, he discussed various common holistic themes over several pages of his website, and as is standard in the field, he didn't reference locations by paragraph number. I duly extracted, compiled, and tabulated them anyway. Since most of them are not particularly interesting, I list them in Appendix 1. It turned out that Carrington had only identified 25 relevant patterns between Luke and the text that either are in or can be connected with Jewish war. Of these, 20 were close to or within the APTBS pattern as shown below. And I guess he has these graphed out. I think these are in green. But you have to take my word for it. They all look like they fit, at least those fit in the pattern. What did he say? 20 out of 25. The ones I was not aware of are in green, and those I had already discovered are in red. Okay. The fact that Carrington had only identified 25 parallels and only 4 of them were ones that I had found myself illustrates how carefully hidden these parallels are, although I think it is also partly explained by the starkly different approaches he and I had taken. Carrington wasn't trying to list parallels with characters described in Jewish war, but was exploring common themes that interested him, particularly regarding antiquities of the Jews. Of his 25 parallels, 18 are a perfect match with the APTVS pattern, 2 are borderline, and 5 do not match. All of the parallels that I did not match turned out to be particularly weak. For example, in one case, Carrington immediately changes his mind and comments that it may not be a parallel after all. For another 3 of them, Carrington links the Gospels not to Jewish war, but rather to the related text Antiquities of the Jews, and indeed locations in that text which cannot be easily placed in the narrative of Jewish war, which is possible since in a few locations the order of the narrative in Antiquities does not strictly follow that in Jewish war. Despite the 5 non-matching parallels being weak or dubious, the most conservative approach is to simply accept that Carrington mentioned them and to purely assess the probability that 18 of his 25 parallels would be an exact match with the APTVS pattern, if this had not been intended by the author. Okay. Let's see what happens on the next page here. Okay, the next page is the beginning of the next chapter, which is no. I think I screwed up again. It's alrighty. I think maybe we should just call it for the day, because I'm having a little bit of trouble finding the next page, and I think we're almost out of time. Please like, share, subscribe, and come back tomorrow to hear the next episode, the next Bible Decode. Today is number 138, and so we'll figure out, get our bearings, and come back. But in the meantime, thanks for tuning in, and have a great day.